Well, hello and welcome to this edition of In the Loop, the podcast where we explore the big questions facing the NHS and care system by engaging with those who are grappling in one way or another with the enormous challenges facing these critical frontline services. I'm Neil Dixon, the former broadcaster and Chief Executive of the NHS Confederation, the General Medical Council and the King's Fund. And as ever, joining me is the irrepressible Roy Lilly, former NHS Chair and commentator. Hello, Roy.
Hello, Neil. Good to see you again. Hi.
Our guest today is Sir Jim Mackey. In April 2025, Jim was appointed as Interim Chief Executive of NHS England. His mission to incorporate NHS England back into the Department of Health and Social Care, to implement the government's grand 10-year plan, and to deliver what ministers have termed a financial reset for the NHS. Quite an agenda. Jim's an accountant by background. He joined the NHS in 1990 and has held numerous leadership roles, including Chief Executive of NHS Improvement, or NHSI as it was known, one of the many acronyms to come and go as ministers and NHS leaders have rearranged the health services organisational deck chairs, always promising great things, but without much evidence of great results. Most of Jim's career has been in the north of England, attracting significant praise for his stewardship of Northumbria Healthcare Foundation Trust. He took over Newcastle Hospitals Foundation Trust at the start of 2024, before taking his current role as Chief Executive of NHS England this year. To say that he is a difficult hand to play would be something of an understatement. As well as facing a non-negotiable target to slash waiting list, he has to oversee yet another major reorganisation, this one just described by the Health Service Journal as a farce, and one that many feel has left thousands of key staff distracted and unsure of their futures. He must also mastermind this so-called financial reset. We'll doubtless find out what that really involves, but for many trusts it must mean significant job losses, an end to spending more than they're given, and cutting some services to benefit others. And on top of all this, it will also mean getting a grip on administrative and back office costs. And unlike the happy noughties when Labour was last in power, this time there will be no big injection of cash year after year. And thus far, no device to enable the huge capital spending that's needed to fix a crumbling infrastructure. Add to all that rebellious and discontented clinical staff, poor patient satisfaction rates, and a Secretary of State who himself said the NHS was facing an existential threat. He said it was broken and in a worse state than ever. It's all daunting. Admittedly, we have seen some progress on waiting lists. Just under 3 million patients have been waiting longer than 18 weeks. This represents a slight decrease from July. Just over 190,000 patients have been waiting for more than a year for treatment, a slight improvement from the previous month. And the median waiting time for patients starting treatment is more than 13 weeks. That's significantly longer than the 8 weeks they waited back in August 2019. And the funding position is perhaps inevitably tight. The NHS may be doing better than every other public service, but the real terms revenue growth over the next few years looks set to be below the historical average. It may be better than the first 10 years of coalition and Conservative administrations, but given the relentless rise in demand, some regard the task as undoable. And what are we to make of social care? Reform looks like being kicked down the road, and councils say they simply cannot cope, all of which means more pressure on both community and acute NHS services. Roy, it's going to be fascinating to see what Sir Jim makes of the predicament facing him and facing the NHS. His job looks more like a poisoned chalice than a bed of roses, doesn't it?
It sure does. It's the dream job, isn't it, really, for anybody who's ever run anything in the NHS. It's the pinnacle of a career in management. But as you say, he's inherited a hell of a mess. I don't think he went to NHS England knowing that he was going to have to demolish NHS England. I don't think that was ever on the cards. We can ask him about that, what the timing was of that. It was certainly never in the manifesto. Then, of course, on top of that, the big question that everybody listening to this wants the answer to is, what is the answer to the redundancies and the funding of the redundancies? I mean, they've all been given the marching orders, really. Half of you are going to get the sack. We just don't know which half, and we don't know when. And now we don't know how we're going to pay for it. It's a dreadful time for people to be working in the NHS. And these are questions that we're going to have to ask him.
Yes, indeed. And it would be impertinent to ask his political views, but you imagine that someone like him, from where he comes and his background, to have rather welcomed the arrival of this administration over the last one. But I guess he may be pretty disappointed about the situation in which he finds himself.
That could well be right, Neil. I mean, he's from mining stock. And I think, like a lot of people working in the NHS, if the NHS had one vote, I think it would vote left of centre. And for a socialist government to come in and wreak the havoc that it has without any planning, I mean, I think it's okay to come in and have radical policies to, slim the costs of the thing down and all the rest of it. But to come in and have no plan how to do it, no impact analysis, no financial predictions, no funding to do anything, and as treating it, he's just sort of bellicosely shouted out of the window, the NHS is broken, like some teenage child, without any real plan. I think it's taken us all by surprise, and I'm sure it's taken Jim by surprise as well.
Do you think that he is also frustrated by inefficiency in the NHS, as it were, because he is an accountant by background? His own record running a trust in the north of England has been balancing the books, achieving what looks like very good results and so on. I guess the question is he lucky because of where he was and what he did, or was he brilliant, or does he look at the rest of the NHS, which is desperately struggling and not able to produce those kind of results, as not really getting a grip on the situation?
Interesting, Neil. I've been to both his hospitals, and when he was at Northumberland, he kind of ran a fiefdom. It's a long way from London, and it seems to me he just ignored London. I mean, look at what he did. He set up his own factory to make PPE. His trust owns the NHS leasing programme for cars. They generate a huge amount of money through the leasing programme. And he got fed up with not being able to discharge people from his hospitals, so he set up his own domiciliary care business and runs it from the hospital. He's fiercely entrepreneurial and a big fan of foundation trusts and giving them more freedom. And I think that was his ambition when he got in, that he wanted to raise the standard of the rest with the best. I think he gets frustrated that probably in quiet moments he says, I did this, why can't everybody else? Well, it's not quite like that, and the places aren't quite the same, and experiences aren't the same, and personalities aren't the same, and talent isn't the same either. And so, yes, I think he does get frustrated with the fact that some hospitals, let's face it, aren't that successful. You can argue they're not successful because of geography, history, economics, but at the end of the day, he is in pursuit of excellence. Well, we can ask him, can't we? He is in the pursuit of excellence, and he doesn't take prisoners at all.
OK, a man of no prisoners. Let's go and welcome Jim. Well, a very warm welcome to Sir Jim Mackey. Jim, welcome to In the Loop. I wonder if I can just begin by asking, I suppose, the most obvious question of the lot. Why did you take on this role? You're very successful up north and seemingly settled back into that kind of world. And now you've taken on this massive national role.
Yeah, really good question. I honestly ask myself that every day, and my wife definitely asks me that every night when I get back home. So we had that there was a lot happening in the spring, as everyone's aware, around the financial position and the British Social Attitude Survey and Amanda deciding she was moving on and, various other things. I mean, honestly, it sounds really twee. I'm a public servant. I've got the NHS in me heart and in me bones. I was really enjoying my time in Newcastle, having been in Northumbria, chief exec 20 years. But I couldn't watch the NHS get into a pithole and drift. And I always just thought in these kinds of roles, if somebody asks you if you can help, you should start from the position of saying yes. That's got me into all kinds of trouble over the years, and it's obviously getting me into trouble in this round. But I just wanted to help. I believe strongly in the value of the NHS. There's a lot of brilliant people in it, and I wanted to try and help get us into a better position.
At short notice, they announced that they were going to get rid of NHS England. Did you know all that when you took on this role, or was it brought on you as a surprise as well?
I didn't know that specifically, no. So it was all a bit of a whirlwind. So there's a couple of weeks that are a bit blurry about what happened when and stuff. But I thought when I'd agreed to do it, that I would be doing something that was a bit more like when we created NHS Improvement, which was NHS Improvement didn't actually exist. It was a sort of an integration vehicle behind which the legal entities sat. So we absolutely knew NHS England, HSE needed to work more closely together and needed to shrink in size, and we needed to refresh what was done centrally versus what was done locally. And we were a couple of weeks in, as I remember, maybe 10 weeks in, when it became apparent that the PM was going to announce abolition. And that's his prerogative. He's the PM. It wasn't for me to argue about. So we've kind of gone with it. I think I still agree with it being the right decision in the end. But it was a bit out of the blue. I don't think it massively changed what we were going to have to do, but it was obviously a big shock for all of the people involved.
Jim, if we could take a pace back for a moment. You've got the reorganisation of NHS England. You've got waiting lists, which are all but static. We've got the 10-year plan with no money, no implementation plan, no impact analysis. And these are all huge structural issues. And then, of course, the finances. I mean, the right way to approach this as a manager is to say, OK, what are the most important things we're going to do? Let's focus on them, and then we'll drag the rest behind us and see how that works out. How do you prioritise what it is you're trying to do?
Can I just correct your point on the waiting list? There's relentless negativity that we're coping with on the waiting list, right? We dropped the waiting list in April, May, and I think June for the first time in 18 years on the waiting list size, which operationally is the least valuable metric. We are reducing waiting times, but massively reduced long waits. Waiting times and lists generally grow over summer. So the published stats do look static, but they usually get worse at this time of year. But
listen, I'm happy to be corrected. I'm just working off the numbers that were published. There is a tiny improvement in individual patients. There's a slight decrease in the 18 weeks. Waiting over 1 year, there's a slight improvement. But the average wait time, the median waiting time for patients starting treatment was 13.4 weeks, a significant increase from the pre-pandemic average of 8.0 weeks. What I'm trying to say is, these are still huge problems.
So I completely agree. We're trying to do a lot in one go. We're trying to do major change on pretty much every front very quickly in what feels like in a rush. At times it feels a bit overwhelming. The original focus for me was around financial discipline and trying to get a grip of the money, because you know what it's like. If you've got no control of the money, everything else goes anyway. And that £4.5 billion problem that we had in the planning round needed to be an immediate focus and getting a leadership response. We've absolutely got that. There was a really strong desire, and this is portrayed as a central push, a political push, but it was actually largely driven by the view from the service that we'd had an operating model that was incredibly complicated, very expensive, very overlappy. One person in a trust, for example, is 6 from overseeing tiers. So there's absolutely need to declutter that, and needs to happen as quickly as we can, because we've got to move at a pace that's more rapid than we have over recent years, which takes you into the reorg and the operating model. But you're right, then 10-year plan and all the big things that we need to shift long term, then add to that the delays and the redundancy costs have added complexity and drift. And we absolutely do feel like we're trying to do too many things at once. I was challenged on this yesterday in the Midlands. The problem we've got is because of the way the service was in decline running into COVID, managed COVID well, and then has struggled since with industrial action, the financial position, the operating model, etc. We actually don't have that much choice to try and improve all of those things at the same time. And some of the longer term things can come to the rescue of our day-to-day problems. So I don't think anyone would argue, for example, in urgent care that we've got absolutely everyone on the wrong part of the pitch. We've got patients in the most expensive part of the system. We've got to somehow get them looked after more in a community setting, not in the context that they're in currently. No one generally argues that's needed. The challenge is how we make improvement across all these things at once. In an ideal world, you would say, we'll do this, then we'll do that, then we'll do the other. And the big problem we've got is I just don't think we'll have the time, because the public aren't as patient with us as would want them to be because of the mess that we'd got into. But actually, some of those longer term things have got to happen more quickly because they do release us from shorter term things. It's our job as leaders, and honestly, every day I feel like I have to regroup myself on it, to try and translate it, try and distill it, simplify it, bite it off into manageable chunks. Most of what I'm going to be doing today will be about how do we, me and a few colleagues in the national team, get our heads around how does that prioritisation work. But we were given this challenge in the spring, and I don't know whether he actually said it or not, but the reported thing that the PM said that the NHS has got to learn how to walk and chew gum at the same time. It's a perception problem for people thinking that the NHS decides what it wants to do and will do one thing at a time to suit its own needs rather than the population's needs. And that's why we've got a lot of shift.
Can I just ask you about the redundancy question? Has it now been resolved? Have you got the money from the Treasury to do it? Was the money identified before the decision to get rid of all these people?
So it's not yet agreed, but we're hoping to get it agreed very soon. There's been lots of arguments, discussions about it this week. It's tied to other negotiations that are going on as well. So it's not a single thing. It's tied to a bunch of things, which is why it's become complicated. I think it's a reasonable challenge to say, look, if this announcement was made, presumably everything was boxed off and lined up behind that. I assumed that that would have happened or was in train when it was all said. But it wasn't. And then it's got complicated as the years gone on because of other things that have changed politically, economically, other issues that have arisen, etc. And we're going hammer and tongs to try and get the thing resolved as quickly as we can. I said a couple of weeks ago, and it caused some ruffles, there is another way of getting on with it. If the way that we ideally want to get it sorted out with a pot of money to enable voluntary redundancy to happen, that doesn't happen. There is another way, and we have to try and get that clear as quickly as we can so we can communicate it, settle people down and bring order to the thing again, because it's gone on for too long.
What's the other way?
I absolutely can't tell you. But it's a more managed way, which we'll do it over a period of time. Generally, for things like voluntary redundancy, a lot of trusts have done this year. If you do it in the early part of the year in an organised way, generally the financials can be managed more evenly. Now, our problem is we've got a lot of people who have already expressed an interest. We haven't agreed for them to go, so at the very start of a process, I do think we need to let them go if we're going to change and simplify the operating model. And they are left hanging to some degree. But it's also important to stress these aren't compulsory redundancies. So it's often portrayed as people are living under the threat that they're going to lose their job. These are people who've asked us to go under a voluntary redundancy scheme.
But there is a huge amount of anxiety, stress from individuals who are not sure where they're going, what's going to happen to their jobs and their careers. And many of those are going to be key people you want to try and push the changes going forward. Do you accept that, and this is not to blame you, but do you accept that as a result of this process, the very people who should be driving forward this change are worried about the name on the office door?
There's no question if you're going to do these things, the best way to do it is to do it quickly. I would have liked all of this to have been concluded before the summer holidays, and we've drifted since then. But it's tied to a lot of complex discussions with government. It's not an excuse. I'm as irritated and annoyed as anybody else is about how long it's dragged on. It's no way to be treating people. But it's also quite complex. And it also isn't the case that we'll kind of threaten people with compulsory redundancy and are not being clear whether they are going to lose their job or they're not. It's people who volunteer to go. And that is a bit different. I've lived in a world where we've had compulsory redundancies. I think that psychological dynamic's really quite a different one.
That's interesting, Jim, and it's a really important point to clarify because, as you know, and I've told you, I get emails every day from people who are desperately worried about their job. The perception is that organisations have got to cut their budgets by 50%. Their biggest heading is personnel. 70% of most organisations is personnel. That means half the personnel are going to go. We just don't know which half. Always saying, and I think this is really important, a really important message. Are we saying that there will be no compulsory redundancies and you can achieve what you want to achieve without compulsory redundancies?
What we were aiming for in the change programme, Roy, was to do it through voluntary redundancy. And probably the expectation was we'd have to have a couple of goes at it. So we'd have to have a round this year, maybe a round next year. And with natural turnover, that would have broadly got us to where we needed to be without compulsory redundancies being directly related to the change process. So that's like caveat. Every business changes at times, so there might be a need. Something gets reorganised in a part of the forest and there'll be a compulsory redundancy scenario, but we're generally trying to avoid that. And without the ability to make voluntary exits, it does increase the risk of compulsory exit at the end, because we'll just run out of road and it'll all have to happen in a rush at the end of the period. So I think it's better for everybody to do it through a VR. And we got quite close to the maths working if we could do that.
Obviously, it depends on the Treasury, doesn't it? And we all know what the situation is with the economy. We've got a budget coming up. But it looks to me, if plan A was, well, we'll get the money from the Treasury, give them a business case and show that we can make savings in the long run if they do the pump priming funding. If we're going to go to plan B, then that's going to slow everything down. If we're going to ingest the cost in our operating costs, which most hospitals really are pretty strapped anyway.
So it is frustrating. As a business case, it makes absolute sense to enable the voluntary redundancy. It's a payback of broadly 2 to 1 quite quickly. Quick return, allows people to move on, and we'll get it agreed at some point, hopefully as quickly as we can. The other way of doing it is slower, it's more complicated, et cetera, et cetera. Just to correct a couple of things though, Roy. So first of all, this is ICBs and NHS England. Trusts have done their version of it this year. They'll continue to do their version of it, but they're not snarled up in this. This is about the ICB reduction and NHS England's reduction as well, which then simplifies the operating model, helps get more money freed up for patient care. The ICB running cost thing had moved from about just under 1.5 billion to 2.2 billion, so it had grown and was still growing, so had to be addressed. And then I'm obviously oversensitive on waiting lists, given what I've been doing for the last few years. We've dropped the waiting list by about 250,000 year on year, and waiting times have fallen pretty significantly year on year, with a couple of percent improvement in the RTT metric year on year, depending on which period you look at, sometimes nearer 3. And over the recent years, it's not static. It is improving pretty steadily. Month on month, it can look static, especially over parts of the seasonal cycle like during summer.
Can I just move us on to funding, Jim? And you will have lived through the noughties when very significant amounts of both capital, there was a private finance initiative and so on, and revenue spending went into the NHS alongside massive ambition, not least, of course, the 18-week came in during that period, which everybody said was impossible. The task you face now is of pretty much historical average increase going over the next few years. So not a generous period. There have been various generous periods. And of course, the big generous period was between 2000 and 2008. But this period is not going to be generous. Arguably, the state of the service is even worse than it was then. And the levels of demand are greater than ever. Is this mission impossible?
I'll not accept it's impossible, but it is incredibly difficult. There's no question about that. The SR is a sort of normal SR. It's not a bumper SR, as you've described. It's what government could afford. It's very good compared with the departments, but it's not good in a historical sense from an NHS perspective. But, we are where we are economically. The NHS is nearly half of public spending, and the economy is very tight. Our growth over recent years, certainly, and people get irritated about comparing to the pre-COVID period, but, the growth since then is enormous. Our workforce has grown massively since then, over 20% since before COVID. Workload has increased by about 8% since that COVID period. So when people are being very clever about productivity, that's our productivity problem. And the other thing in all this is, doesn't matter what you look at, whether it's CHE, spend operating costs, variation between hospitals on how the model's set up, how many people get admitted versus not admitted in other places. The variations on absolutely every metric you see is enormous. Our absence is a lot higher than it was before. We've got more people absent than we've ever had. So you can see if you're Treasury, you look at all this and you say, we're giving you what we can absolutely afford to give you. You've got all this stuff to go at. And we all agree we've got all this stuff to go at. The test is, as you pointed out earlier on, whether it is possible to actually get out all these things in time, make the changes that we want in time. I am an optimist. I'm naturally an optimist. I'm a Newcastle supporter, as I keep saying. I have to be. We have to give this our best shot. And there is a view of the NHS that the only answer is more money. Very deep view in the Treasury and in government is the only answer is more money. And there is also a reasonable view that the NHS performs better when money's tight. The worst year financially I had in my career was 2003-04. I was a young finance director. We had growth of like 7% real terms or something. But we had commitments being made through the system of like 12%. And I think the NHS either bust the vote or nearly bust the vote that year. That was horrendous. And then, some of the other years when we were managing to deliver an awful lot, the financial settlement was much tighter. So I don't think it's a kind of straight line necessarily between resources available and what's possible and how we perform. But if we pull all this off, and the people are really trying to pull it all off, there's no question about that. People will write books about it. It'll be a pretty big dramatic turnaround for the NHS, maybe the biggest public service turnaround that's ever happened.
You mentioned about variation in performance. Is there inevitably big variation in the quality of the management? You were very successful in your trust, but there are other trusts that have really struggled enormously. Is that because they're unlucky because of the situation that they're in? Or, in your view, is there some poor management that needs to be tackled as well?
We've got a bit used to blaming the management and the leadership in the NHS. And, you've got to ask yourself if nearly everybody's struggling, whether it's the players or it's the game. And I think we've been playing a game that's just been too hard and just too messy, unclear what the rules were, unclear on the incentives, in a really difficult context, COVID, 18 months of industrial action, all those sorts of things. But there's variation. You're going to have some individuals and some teams that are better than others. And what we're trying to do this year is simplify, make it more rules-based, be clearer on expectation. When we eventually get this year's planning guidance out, it'll be crisper, it'll be tight, it'll be less voluminous, it'll move for sort of next sets of the rules, etc., to try and support people to prioritise and deliver what they need to do. But there is variation, there's no question about that, but there's an awful lot of local drivers, structural, the buildings, workforce, and in the places that have performed better over time, they've generally got longevity. Not just the chief exec. So Northumbria, which I left in December 23, still performing really well. A lot of the clinical leaders there have been clinical leaders and grown up in the system forever. So there's been a progressive development and evolution. One thing, without this being too long a rambly question, I was in West Herts recently, and that's had a bit of a difficult history as an organisation. The physical environment's terrible for those staff to work in there. And Matthew and the team, I think, have done a fantastic job in getting really great results in very, very difficult circumstances. So you can see the value of brilliant leadership when it's released and it's able to do what it needs to do. What we're trying to do is to create the conditions that allow most people to succeed and to do well, rather than it be so complicated you can't actually work it out.
Let's focus for a moment, if we can, on ICBs. 7 ICB leaders have left, bailed out, gone. Is there a future for ICBs? Because you're introducing regions now. We've got 7 regions. Perhaps with 10 regions, you could run it without ICBs and make the trusts run the local health economies, gives them some pretty tight objectives around population health, pay them to keep people healthy rather than fix them up when they're sick. What do you see as the future in that part of the system?
Did we have too many? I always thought 42 was too many. And also the variation, I always thought we would struggle to sustain that over time. And also very hard to have a consistent operating model across the whole of the NHS when the population they're serving ranges from 8 to 900,000 to 3.5 million. It necessarily means it's a complicated operating model. So I think that had to be standardised, and it had become too expensive. We just couldn't afford that system. As a person who's largely lived in trusts, in FTs, I didn't love commissioning. But the absence of commissioning over recent years has been a bit of a problem. So we all thought there was a need to restore the value of commissioning, and that'll be the main job of ICBs. I think it was too much to expect ICBs to do that, work on the interface with the local authority system and the mayoral authorities and all those sorts of things, and performance manage the financial responsibility for them, which is why we've changed it and modified the system so performance management largely sits with regions. None of this can be final and forever, though, and as integrated health organisations start developing and taking place, the model will change and evolve. And I think one of the things we've got to get our heads around is make sure we don't lock ourselves into something thinking it's fixed forever, because there's an awful lot going to change now. And neighbourhood care picks up as we get integrated health organisations work, and there's a very strong push from some mayors about having more joint work and across those footprints, etc.
I wonder if I could just ask whether you feel ICBs have actually worked. My experience of dealing with Kent and Medway was that the title said Integrated Care Board, but the local authority was, right or wrong, pursuing its own furrow. The Director of Social Care was on the board briefly and then said, this is an NHS organisation, it's not an integrated board, and he left it. So the idea that there was joint efforts other than working at provider level where, you did see progress, but the ICB became simply a performance manager on top of a region that was also performance managing. We certainly had meetings where you could have 40 people sitting watching how is the trust doing this month, and it just seemed a ludicrous way of trying to manage a system. Just reflect a little bit on ICBs. I guess they're variable across the country.
Yeah, you've just described why we've made the change, I think, really. So they were clearly very compromised. You could feel them compromised early on about, do I commission, do I spend my time at the boundaries with the councils, or do I performance manage the system? I'm more like an SHE. And you could see that some made choices as to about where they focused their attention. What was the dominant thing that they looked at, because it was going to be really hard to do all of those things. That is partly big part of why we've made the change. I think it's unfair to say that they've failed, because I think they were just probably asked to do a lot of complicated things at a time for the NHS, when we were under a lot of pressure and at times were tricky. But, I've worked in a world where I think we had a very good ICB, very well led. But that thing about responsibility for working with the council and local partner relations, it was their job. I also thought it was always part of my job as a trust chief exec. So in some parts of the country, you could see where it became something where, well, that must be the ICB's job. I'll have to get out of that, kind of thing. That was never the case. So all we've tried to do is to strip it back to address the point you've made about having 2 or 3 tiers doing the oversight and regulation, and that how unfair that feels when you're on the end of it. And I've experienced this and talking to people about it, where you've got a couple of poor people in the trust talking to many people in the regulatory and oversight system, getting frustrated with them about why they haven't done something. And we have to rebalance this system so that those people who are nearer to hands-on patients are enabled within a rules-based system to do what they need to do. And the regulation and oversight is as lean, is as pacey, and is as direct as humanly possible.
If you look at the frequent flyers in the NHS, the over 65s and the under 9s are the 2 biggest customers we've got. And if you think about looking after them, the salvation of that is not in the hands of the NHS. It's in health visitors, it's in schools, and it's supporting families. For older people, it's community services, district nurses, as rare as hen's teeth now, primary care. I mean, all of that shift. If the NHS is going to succeed and not become totally overwhelmed, it has to stop people getting sick in the first place. And if we just worked in those 2 spaces, the under 9s and the over 65s, it'll make a huge difference to us and give them their headroom to get more stuck into waiting lists. Against that background, what does good look like? Paint us a picture of what are we aiming for? Cheer me up, Jim.
So, I mean, longer term, Roy, it is doing what you've just described. We've got an imbalance in our system that's grown over years. We're less spent at the community end, primary care end, more in hospitals. We're out of sync with where we used to be and out of sync with internationally better performing systems. Longer term, that we will have restored that balance. We've got everybody in the right part of the pitch. We'll be using technology in a way that helps people rather than a way that drives everybody mad. So we'll have a much more community, locality, neighbourhood-orientated system that stops hospitalising people unnecessarily, but people have more choice and control of what they want and need, enabled via technology wherever we can, and if people are able to access it. Longer term, we'll always be challenged with money, but there's a way of that being accepting we're constrained, but we're managing it really well. Everyone's got a bit of headroom so they can make investments long term, they can make strategically, and they're doing it largely local volition. And so they're not being centrally directed for everything. And the big test is real success long term is the reverse of the British social attitude surveys that we've seen for the last couple of years. The public overwhelmingly saying, this NHS is wonderful, these people are wonderful, I love what they're doing, don't you touch them. And that's all achievable, but short term, manageable chunks, step by step. Let's make sure we manage the money. Let's make some improvements on performance as we've set out, clarify who's doing what, but make steps on the 10-year plan. Start building some of this stuff that's going to work in 10 years' time rather than 10 years' time.
The other massive challenge you've got there, Jim, is the clinical staff. You've got a lot of managers who are concerned about their own futures and distracted and all the rest of it. And I suspect, as you say, trusts have gone through a bit of this as well. So I'm sure quite a lot of unsettlement there. But you've also got doctors who appear to be very unhappy. We've got resident doctors, as they're now called, who have levels of disillusionment and who seem to dislike the system that they're working in.
Yeah.
How do you overcome all that? Because I think that is, again, going back to not just say the noughties were all wonderful, but it wasn't like that. It didn't seem as if the professions, plural, and it's not just the medics, the nurses, seem very cross as well.
Just before you answer that, Jim, the morning of this recording, parts of the BMA are reported as writing to GPs who are now concerned about this online appointment system, egging them on to refer everybody to hospital and bring the system to a grinding halt through referrals.
Yeah.
I mean, in my, I've been around the NHS for 50 years. I've never seen that kind of change in attitude at any other time. It's really very worrying.
It is, absolutely. And that specific issue was actually the North East North Cumbria LMC. It was drawn to my attention on Wednesday. Coincidentally, on that day, I met with a former colleague in primary care in Northumberland who was at pains to say, we want absolutely nothing to do with that, by the way. We're not doing that. We've got good relationships locally. We're looking after our patients. We're not going to be distracted with this nonsense. So we shouldn't assume that this is everybody. But on the point about resident doctors, we are in a bad way where there's a pretty significant dislocation between them and what they want and they need versus what we as employers want and need versus what the population want. And we've had a period now for a few years where that's been difficult and fractious because of industrial action and differences of views. Somehow, we've all got to get back on the same page again. I still think when I meet consultants and other clinical colleagues who are a bit more experienced and senior, they still value their employment in a way that's more aligned to the way you described it. Love what they do generally, frustrated with bits and pieces, as you would imagine, but still really love what they do and they love their position in the community as a result of that. But we have got a problem with resident doctors, which is why, it's a first step, 10-point plan. Let's fix some of this basic stuff that is causing irritation. I think we've got to fundamentally look at how the training and the rotation system works, because they clearly don't like it. I mean, as an employer, I didn't like it very much. We've removed that bit that used to be valuable, where as a resident, you come out of medical school and you think, I want to work with that person. He's a wonderful geriatrician. She's a brilliant gastroenterologist. I want to be in their firm. You'd go there You'd work with them, you'd learn from them, you'd be part of the family. And now we've had them in a system where we're sort of move them around randomly, so they've lost the sense of belonging and attachment. I think that's a big problem. And we have to somehow get a hold of that and restore it and reset it, but in a way that isn't restoring and resetting something that existed in 1948. Make it fit for the future. Young people, I've got 2 kids, they think about life and work differently. And we have to lean into that. And the best way is talk to them, listen to them, try and work it out rather than slugging it out through industrial action.
Jim, it's been enormously interesting talking to you. We've come to the end of our time together. Thank you very much. You've been very frank, and I think probably a lot of people will be very reassured to hear what you've said about the future of their employment in the NHS as well. It's a tricky time. I think we might say we're in safe hands. So, Jim Mackey, thank you for talking to us.
Yeah, thank you a lot, Jim. Well, Roy, that was a very frank assessment. And you just feel that while he is, as you'd expect, very much on top of all the issues which he's grappling with, he does appear to be fighting with one hand tied behind his back. He is saying that there are big variations. The NHS had a lot of staff come in. Its productivity has not kept up with what it should have done. On the other hand, turning all that around when you're expected to do a massive reorganisation, he said he backed the abolition of NHS England. He certainly didn't back it in the way that it's been done. You absolutely got that clarity, didn't you?
I did. You know, I've known Jim a long time, and, you know, perhaps I'm prejudiced to him. I felt reassured. I mean, I'm not working in the NHS now, and it's easy for me to say from the sort of sofa, but I feel reassured in that he is a practical man. He's experienced. He understands what the issues are. And although he doesn't have immediate access to the money he needs, and he's got obviously politics gumming the works up as well with streeting these stupid things he keeps announcing, but I think he's a safe pair of hands, and we have to give him the time and the space to get on and try and fix some of this stuff. But you're right. I absolutely agree with your analysis that he is fighting one hand behind his back, no question about it.
I thought it was interesting that he reflected on what they needed to do in terms of engaging with the service and the service's leaders and simplifying the performance management, which I 100% agree with, having watched it at very close quarters. But he also reflected on where the staff are at the moment, and the staff are in a really bad place. Anybody who's managing any kind of change program will get staff resistance to that. But this is more than that, isn't it? It seems almost like a generational challenge. And when we talked to Jennifer Dixon of the Health Foundation, and she talked about, as a doctor, going and seeing some of these doctors, they were so different in the way that they looked at the world and how you engage with them, but how you manage that. And Jim's absolutely right. The only way to get around this is to have reasonable conversations. I think the difficulty they have is, of course, they're not always talking to the frontline docs all the time. They're talking to their representatives, who sometimes actually have even more extreme views than their members.
There's a lot in that, you know. If you talk to resident doctors and you see how they're bullied on the rotas and how they're shoved around, and it's a wretched life. And there was that famous case of the doctor who had to change their wedding day because of the rota. You know, I mean, that is just completely bloody outrageous. And I think they have an awful lot to moan about. And I think they've come to the end of their tether on a lot of it. I mean, I'm no fan of strikes, and I personally wouldn't go on strike. But I understand that. And you have to understand that before you can do anything with it. And Jim's right. You know, he said as an employer, it's no good for him either. We need somehow or other to get back to where doctors feel part of the community that they're working in. And they don't. They just kind of land from Mars and do a bit and move on to another planet. And then there's the other bit of the relationship that we have with our staff. Every day, people tell me in my post bag how awful it is working, the managers particularly, under the threat of redundancy. And I'm very pleased that he took the opportunity to say that, you know, there will be no, well, I suppose he didn't say there will be no compulsory redundancy, but I mean,
they're going to try and avoid it.
I get the impression they'll do everything to avoid it, yes. And I think that will come as a welcome relief to a lot of the people who are listening to this. I hope it does. I mean, how would I sum this up? This is probably the most difficult time financially, politically, economically the NHS has faced. And the guy doing the job, he's run a successful trust. He knows how the system works. He understands people. He knows what's got to be done, and it can't be all done at once. As I said to him, I feel he's a safe pair of hands. And no doubt people listening to us will soon tell us whether they think he is as well.
As indeed his wife will. And if he listens to her, he won't be there much longer. So we have to hope that he doesn't listen to her. Okay, thanks very much, Roy. Good to be with you again in The Loop.
Thanks, Neil.